Hello and welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am so glad you have joined us today.
It's good to be here.
We are about to take a serious look at a text that feels incredibly relevant to anyone who has ever looked at the state of the church, or maybe just the state of the world, and felt a really heavy weight of despair.
Mm.
We're opening up the Treasury of David today to look at Psalm 79.
And you're right, Psalm 79 is not light reading. It's a song of Asaph. And it's a text that's written for the ruins. It's written for the smoke and the rubble of the beloved city.
It really does set a stark scene. I think, often we come to the Psalms looking for personal comfort, maybe a little boost for our day, but this is corporate grief. This is national overthrow.
Precisely. And the theological lens here is just vital. If we read this only as history, as something that happened to Israel a long, long time ago, we completely miss the point. This is a look at how God's people are supposed to respond when the church is under attack.
Right.
And maybe more terrifyingly, it's how we respond when it seems like God himself is angry with us.
That's the central tension, isn't it? That's what we're going to try to unpack. The problem is laid out in the very first verse. The heathen have entered God's inheritance. The bad guys have won, essentially.
And not just one on the battlefield. I mean, that would be bad enough. They have entered the sanctuary itself.
Yeah. We're going to be relying heavily on Charles Spurgeon's The Treasury of David for this discussion. And what I really love about this particular source is that Spurgeon, he acts as a curator, really. He brings in voices from all over church history. You've got Augustine, Luther, Calvin, Musculus.
Whole chorus.
A whole chorus of theologians all grappling with this same disaster. It's not just one man's opinion.
No. It creates a very full, a very rich picture. And our mission today really is to figure out the solution that Asaph presents. How do you plead with God when everything has fallen apart? Spurgeon identifies what he calls the mightiest weapon in the armory of prayer. And I think we need to find that weapon by the end of this discussion.
Okay, let's do it. Let's get right into the horror of it. Segment 1 covers the first 4 verses, and it starts with this complaint just being poured out. Verse 1 says, O God, the heathen are come into thine inheritance. Thy holy temple have they defiled. They have laid Jerusalem on heaps.
You can just hear the shock in that opening cry. It's a cry of amazement. Asaph is looking around, and he just cannot believe what he's seeing.
Right.
The stranger, the uncircumcised, the pagan, hasn't just crossed the border. He's polluted the very courts of the Lord.
Spurgeon has this insight where he says it's bad enough to have enemies in your own house. I mean, if someone breaks into your home, that's deeply traumatic. But he says it's infinitely worse to meet them in the house of God.
That is a violation of the sacred. I mean, it's a different category of evil. The source material points out that it was a triple pollution. The Holy Land, the Holy House, and the Holy City were all defiled.
And there's a theological implication there that applies to the church today, isn't there? It's the horror of what Jesus called the tares sown with the wheat.
Exactly. It's that scary thought. The idea that wicked men can be numbered within the ministry. That the enemy is not just outside the gate, but inside.
Yeah.
It's that internal decay that so often precedes the external destruction. But here in the psalm, the physical destruction is just, it's total. The text says they lay Jerusalem on heaps.
On heaps.
The visual imagery is just wreckage, like a building that's been imploded. It's just a pile of rubble. The joy of the nation is completely gone.
And if the destruction of the buildings wasn't enough, we get to verses 2 and 3, and it honestly turns into a horror movie. The dead bodies of thy servants have they given to be meat unto the fowls of the heaven, the flesh of thy saints unto the beasts of the earth.
It is gruesome. There's no other word for it.
It is, and the source material connects this to a couple of really specific historical moments. There's the Maccabean period under Antiochus Epiphanes, where a man named Bacchides was slaying the scribes.
Yes, a terrible time. But it also points forward, doesn't it, to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D.
It does. And the Treasury of David includes a detail from Josephus, I think, that the Romans crucified so many Jews around the walls of the city that there was no room left for the crosses and no more wood left to build them.
That's the level of carnage we're talking about. It's almost unimaginable.
So with this image of unburied bodies everywhere, Augustine brings up a really interesting perspective. In the ancient world, and honestly in our world too, not being buried is seen as a supreme indignity, a final insult. But Augustine argues that burial is really for the comfort of the living, not the dead.
That is classic Augustine, isn't it?
Mm.
Always looking for the pastoral angle. Even in the bleakest situation, he's trying to comfort the survivors.
How so?
Well, he's saying, look, the martyrs do not lose their eternal reward just because their bodies were eaten by beasts. The resurrection will gather every atom. The soul is safe with God, no matter what happens to the corpse.
That's true, and that's a necessary theological distinction to make. But the psalm doesn't seem to be taking that high road of stoic acceptance. The psalmist is absolutely horrified.
You're right. And that's the tension. While Augustine is correct theologically about the safety of the believer's soul, the psalm is using this horror for a different purpose. It's arguing for the inhuman and barbarous cruelty of the enemy.
I see.
It's being presented as evidence in a courtroom. It's a sign of God's own indignation that he would allow his chosen people to be treated like roadkill.
The phrase uses that their blood was shed like water.
And that implies devaluation. You pour water out on the ground and you don't think twice about it. It's worthless. These invaders were shedding human blood, the blood of the covenant people, as if it were nothing.
And the sheer volume of it. The text says there was none to bury them.
And it's not that people didn't want to. It's that the survivors were too few, or too afraid, or maybe the piles of bodies were just too high. It paints a picture of total helplessness.
Which leads right into the next layer of suffering, which is the psychological aspect. Verse 4, we are become a reproach to our neighbors, a scorn and derision to them that are round about us.
This is the sting of mockery. You're down, you're bleeding, your home is a ruin, and the people next door are pointing and laughing at you.
And it specifically says our neighbors.
Yes, and the source material points out that often those who are nearest show the least sympathy.
Why do you think that is? Is it just old rivalries?
Well, there's often old animosity between neighboring people groups, that's true. But there's also this hard logic that the world uses. If you are suffering this badly, you must have been a terrible sinner.
The prosperity gospel in reverse.
Kind of, yeah. Or they say, if your God was real, he wouldn't let this happen to you, so your faith is a sham.
Chrysostom, the great preacher, he had a note on this. He said that scorn wounds the soul, whereas stripes only wound the body.
That's a striking way to put it. You can heal from a cut. But to have your faith mocked while you're in the depths of suffering, to hear them ask, where is your God now? That cuts right to the spirit.
There's a really vivid illustration in the notes from a traveler named J.L. Porter. He describes visiting what's known as the Jews' place of wailing in Jerusalem. This was written in the 19th century, but the image is just timeless.
It's a very moving description. He talks about seeing the white faces and lustrous black eyes of the exiles. They're just pouring out their hearts over these ancient stones.
He describes old men tottering on their staves and little girls just gazing at the wall. They're kissing the stones, bathing them with tears. It connects this ancient psalm to a grief that has endured for centuries and centuries.
It really does. It shows that the reproach Asaph talks about wasn't a short-term problem. It became the defining characteristic of the diaspora for generations. They became a byword. And that forces the question that starts the next segment.
Right. Segment 2 begins with verse 5, and the question is, how long, Lord?
This is the pivot. Notice the shift in the language. In the first 4 verses, the complaint is all about the enemy. They did this, they did that. But now, the address is directly to God.
Wilt thou be angry forever?
This is the big realization. The enemy is just the instrument. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Romans, they are just the rod. The hand holding the rod is God's.
That is a hard pill to swallow for modern listeners, I think. We like to attribute evil solely to bad human actors. But Asaph sees God's sovereign permission behind it all.
Musculus makes this point very clearly in the notes. He says, we must recognize God's hand in our afflictions. He says it's not just the malice of the enemy, it's the discipline of the Father.
And if you don't see that...
If you don't see that, you can't repent. You just become a victim. You wallow in self-pity rather than seeing yourself as a chastised son being brought back into line.
The text uses the word jealousy. Shall thy jealousy burn like fire? Now, in a human context, jealousy is almost always a negative emotion. It's petty, it's insecure.
Of course. But in the Reformed context, and more importantly, the biblical context, divine jealousy is the protective, exclusive love of a husband for his wife. Jerome has a great insight here. He says God is jealous because he loves.
If he didn't care, he wouldn't be jealous.
Indeed. If a husband sees his wife running after other lovers, which is exactly what Israel did with idols, and he doesn't get jealous, it means he doesn't actually love her. He's indifferent. So God's jealous anger here is paradoxically, proof of his covenant love.
But the prayer is about the intensity of it. The fire analogy. Fire consumes. Asaph is saying, okay, we get it. We know we messed up. We know you're jealous. But if this fire keeps burning at this heat, there will be nothing left of us.
So he tries to redirect the fire, which brings us to verses 6 and 7. Pour out thy wrath upon the heathen that have not known thee, and upon the kingdoms that have not called upon thy name.
This is the cry for justice. And it seems like a logical plea. Lord, if you have to be angry at the people who don't even acknowledge you exist.
It's an appeal to God's sense of proportion. The source defines these heathen very specifically as the prayerless, those who have not called upon thy name.
David Clarkson had a very strong note on this. He said that the neglect of prayer is a crime that makes men liable to God's wrath.
That's a convicting thought, isn't it? We tend to think of crimes as active sin, stealing, killing, lying. But Clarkson argues that even the heathen have a duty to pray to the Creator. To simply ignore God is a capital offense in his universe.
So Asaph is essentially saying, look at these people. They ignore you completely. They are devouring Jacob like wolves tearing up a sheep. Why are you punishing us so severely while they seem to get away with it?
And he uses that metaphor of the pasture. They have devoured Jacob and laid waste his dwelling place. It's not just that they killed the flock. They destroyed the means of survival. They scorched the earth, ruined the sheepcote.
This brings us to what I think is really the heart of the psalm, segment 3. Because Asaph knows that just pointing the finger at the bad guys isn't enough. Israel isn't innocent in all this.
No, they're absolutely not. And this is where we get into what Spurgeon calls the master argument of prayer. Verse 8 starts with a full-throated confession. Oh, remember not against us former iniquities.
Former iniquities. This touches on a concept that's very strong in the Old Testament, but maybe a bit lost on us today. This idea of accumulated corporate guilt.
Yes, the idea that generations can lay up stores of transgression. It's like a national debt that just keeps compounding interest over the centuries.
Spurgeon quotes John Gill here, who references a Jewish saying. I found this absolutely fascinating. They had a saying that every punishment Israel ever receives holds an ounce of the sin of the golden calf.
That is such a powerful image. The idea is that the foundational sin of idolatry at Mount Sinai started a trajectory that the nation never fully escaped. Every subsequent judgment has a little bit of that original rebellion mixed into it.
But how does that work in Reformed theology? I mean, is it fair for me to be punished for my great-grandfather's sin? People struggle with that.
It's not about individual punishment for another's crime in a strict legal sense. It's about corporate solidarity. We are part of a people. We're part of a nation. If the nation has been rotting from the inside for 100 years, the final collapse might just happen to fall in our time. And notice, Asaph numbers himself with the sinners. He says, us.
He doesn't say, Lord, forgive them for their past. He says, remember not against us.
That is true intercession. You stand in the gap, you identify with the people, and you own the guilt.
Then comes the plea. Let thy tender mercies speedily prevent us. Now we have to unpack that word prevent. In modern English, it just means to stop something from happening.
Right. But in the King James English, which translates the Hebrew concept so well here, it means to go before, to anticipate, to meet someone.
Like prevent, coming before.
Precisely. Asaph is saying, Lord, rush out to meet us with your mercy. Come before us in our need before we are completely and utterly destroyed.
And what's the argument he uses? It's fascinating. He doesn't say, help us because we are so sorry, or help us because we promised to do better. He says, for we are brought very low.
This is the argument from misery, and it is a perfectly valid plea in the court of heaven. The believer is allowed to use their own wretched condition as a reason for God to act.
Spurgeon uses the idea of being emptied out.
Yes, the vessel is dry. We have nothing left. No strength, no resources, no hope in ourselves. And that very emptiness is what attracts God's mercy. He loves to fill the empty.
But that isn't even the strongest argument in the psalm. We have now arrived at verse 9. Spurgeon calls this the great gun of the battle.
Help us, O God of our salvation, for the glory of thy name.
Why is this the great gun? What makes this plea so powerful?
Because it shifts the focus entirely off of man and places it squarely onto God himself. William Greenhill, one of the old Puritans, points this out brilliantly. He says God does nothing for the sake of the people's merit. Not their tears, not their prayers, not even their faith, in a meritorious sense. He acts for his name.
So salvation isn't just about saving people from their trouble. It's about God vindicating his own character before a watching world.
Indeed. Think about it. If God's people are wiped out, his name is tarnished, the heathen will say one of two things. Either he was too weak to save them, or he was unfaithful and broke his covenant promises. So Asaph appeals to God's own self-interest, you could say. Do it for your reputation.
And there's a double plea here too, isn't there? Deliver us and purge away our sins.
Yes, and that is the Lutheran and Reformed synthesis right there. We always need two things. We need the removal of the rod, that's the deliverance from the enemy, but we also need the removal of the guilt. That's the purging of the sin that brought the rod in the first place.
You can't just ask for the pain to stop. You have to ask for the disease to be cured.
Exactly. And both are gifts of pure grace. William Gurnall had a beautiful note on this. He said, God is no loser by showing mercy.
I loved that quote when I read it. His glory is enhanced more by saving than by damning.
It's so true. God's justice is certainly glorified in the punishment of sin, yes. But his mercy, his grace, his loving kindness, his long-suffering, those are the multifaceted jewels in his crown. So when we pray, save us for your name's sake, we are aligning our prayer with God's highest goal, which is his own glory.
That is a complete game changer for how we should pray. Instead of just coming to God and saying, God, I really need this, or I really want this, the argument is, God, glorify yourself by handling this impossible situation.
It takes all the pressure off of us. It's no longer about whether I am good enough or sincere enough to be answered. It's about whether God is good enough to keep his word and honor his own name. And the answer to that is always yes.
Moving into segment 4, we see this deep concern for God's reputation continue. Verse 10 asks, wherefore should the heathens say, where is their God?
There's that mocking question again. Where is he? If the church falls, if God's people are destroyed, the world assumes God is either weak or absent.
Asaph then asks for something that sounds, well, a bit vengeful to our modern ears. He wants known vengeance. He wants the revenging of the blood of God's servants to be done in our sight. He wants to see it happen.
This brings up the whole difficulty of imprecatory prayer, praying for curses or judgment on one's enemies. Many modern Christians are very uncomfortable with this.
Yeah, we're told to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. How do we square that?
It's a critical question. And we have to distinguish between personal spite and a desire for public justice. Asaph isn't saying, I want to see them suffer because they hurt my feelings. He's saying, I want the world to see that you are a God of justice, that evil does not win in the end.
So it's a desire for the public vindication of right over wrong.
Yes. Spurgeon says the destruction of Antichrist, represented here by these pagan enemies, is a valid and righteous hope. If we truly love good, we must, by definition, hate evil, and we must desire to see evil stopped, judged, and removed.
Then in verse 11, the tone shifts dramatically from the battlefield to the dungeon. Let the sighing of the prisoner come before thee.
This is one of the most tender verses in the entire psalm. P.B. Power in the source material has a wonderful analysis of this sigh.
He calls it an unexpressed declaration.
Isn't that beautiful? Sometimes you are so weary, so broken, you can't even form a sentence to pray, you just sigh. And Power says that that sigh tells a long, complex tale of sorrow without a single word being spoken.
And the text gives us this incredible assurance that God hears the sigh. It reaches the throne of grace.
It does. It says, let it come before thee. It implies that God is actively listening for the nonverbal prayers of his suffering people.
The verse mentions those appointed to die. The Hebrew is literally the sons of death.
These are people on death row. In the historical context, these were the Jews captured and waiting to be executed by the invaders. But spiritually, it applies to anyone who finds themselves in what Bunyan called the dungeon of giant despair.
People who feel like it's all over, there's no way out.
Yes. The source material uses the image of a lamb living between the lion's jaws. That's the situation. And the prayer is, according to the greatness of thy power, preserve them. It takes great, overwhelming power to snatch a soul back from the very edge of death and despair.
Then we get back to the justice aspect in verse 12. And render unto our neighbors sevenfold into their bosom their reproach, wherewith they have reproached thee, O Lord.
Sevenfold retribution. Abraham Wright, another commentator, explains that this isn't unjust. It isn't asking for more than they deserve, which is what it might sound like.
How so? Sevenfold sounds like a lot.
Because a scorn against an infinite God is an infinite wrong. If you mock the creator of the universe, there is no finite punishment that is technically too much. So sevenfold here is a Hebraism, a measure of completeness. It means give them the full and perfect measure of what their sins have earned.
The phrase into their bosom is very interesting. It sounds so affectionate, but it's clearly not.
No, not at all. It refers to the oriental dress of the time, the long flowing robes that had a large fold at the chest which acted almost like a pocket or a bag. You could carry grain or other goods in your bosom.
Ah, so the image is of God pouring shame and judgment right into their lap.
Exactly. They can't drop it. They can't lose it. They have to carry it with them. It implies a full, personal, and unavoidable measure of return for their wickedness.
That brings us to the final segment, segment 5. And after all that darkness, there's a turn. The promise of eternal praise. Verse 13 starts with, "So we, thy people and sheep of thy pasture, will give thee thanks forever."
This is the resolution. This is the statement of faith. Despite the anger, despite the fire, despite the blood running like water, the fundamental covenant relationship holds. They are still thy people. They are still thy sheep.
Delitzsch, the commentator, connects this back to Psalm 78, doesn't he?
He does. The flock needs the shepherd. The whole history of Israel is the story of God leading a stubborn, wayward flock through dangerous and hostile territory. And despite it all, they are still his flock.
And the promise is to show forth thy praise to all generations.
And this is the purpose of deliverance. Why should God save us? What's the point? So that we can hand down the history of his grace to our children and they to their children.
The source material puts it so beautifully. History survives on the tablets of the church.
The dark days, the days of the ruins and the heaps, become the necessary prelude to the brightest displays of God's love. If there were no danger, there would be no rescue. If there were no great rescue, there would be no great song of deliverance to sing.
So the psalm moves from the heaps of Jerusalem to the eternal song of the flock.
It is a process from sight to faith. Sight sees the ruins and despairs. Faith looks beyond the ruins and sees the shepherd who will never forsake his sheep.
We have covered a lot of ground here. Let's try to summarize this for the listener. We started with the problem. The church is under attack, God seems angry, and we feel totally helpless.
We saw the absolute horror of the invasion, the defilement of sacred space, the dishonoring of the dead, the psychological sting of mockery.
Then we had to look at the logic of God's anger, that he uses enemies as a rod of discipline for his own jealous love, not because he's indifferent, but because he cares.
Then we unpacked the master argument. We don't plead our innocence or our own merit. We plead our misery, and much more importantly, we plead God's holy name. That's the great gun.
We saw the need for public vindication and justice, but also the incredible tenderness of a God who hears the prisoner's faintest sigh.
And finally, it all culminates in the unwavering commitment to praise him forever as his people, his sheep.
The core lesson for us, it seems to be this. When you are brought very low, do not argue your own goodness. Argue God's glory.
That is it. That is the key of Reformed thinking right there. It is not about us. It is always, always about him and his glory.
Now, before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought that really struck me while I was reading about the dead bodies being given to the fowls of the air.
Okay, what is that?
Well, we tend to think of the grave as a final resting place. We put so much stock in a decent burial. We have funerals, we erect headstones. But consider the image of the unburied saints in this psalm. Their bones are scattered. Their flesh is consumed. They are treated with absolute contempt by the world.
It is the ultimate rejection, the final indignity.
But doesn't that, in a way, almost guarantee a future resurrection where God vindicates that very dust?
That's a striking thought. Unpack that a bit.
If God cares so much about his name and his glory, as we've just established, and these are his saints, he cannot leave them in the bellies of beasts forever. That would be a victory for the enemy. So perhaps the very lack of an earthly grave, the lack of any human honor, is the surest sign that their glory must be entirely heavenly. The world gave them no honor, so God himself must give them all of it.
And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. It completely changes how we view those heaps of ruins, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They're not just piles of rubble, they are. They're just waiting for the trumpet.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into Psalm 79.
It has been a pleasure.
We will see you next time.